Some projects sound impossible the first time you hear them. Ideas so vast, so audacious that they feel like exaggeration.
We have doubts about the possibility, the viability of this idea.
In northern China, a desert was not simply bordered or tamed. A living wall encircled it. Thousands of kilometers of trees, shrubs, and grasses, planted in some of the harshest, driest landscapes on Earth, form a belt strong enough to slow shifting dunes.
To China, where the Gobi Desert grows by about 3,000 kilometers each year.
This is the story of how a nation attempted to stop a desert in its tracks, and how human ingenuity, persistence, and scale came together to challenge one of nature's oldest forces. The birth of the Great Green Wall. By the end of 2024, satellites passing over the Tarim Basin recorded something that had never appeared in their imagery before. A perfect loop of green stretching for more than 3,000 kilometers around the Taklamakan Desert. It was so precise that analysts initially assumed it was an artifact of data stitching, an error in the image. But the line was real. A belt of vegetation, planted piece by piece, trench by trench, around the entire circumference of the Sea of Death. No nation had ever attempted to enclose a drifting desert before, let alone one of this size. That scope is nearly unfathomable. The program covers 13 provinces, from Xinjiang in the west to Heilongjiang in the east, and from Inner Mongolia in the north to the Shaanxi region, touching 551 counties in total. Its planned area is about 4,069,000 square kilometers, roughly 42.4% of China's landmass. Over the decades, scientists and foresters mapped, experimented, and learned. In the first 40 years alone, the program completed over 30,143,000 hectares of tree planting and conservation. By 2018, the forest coverage in the project area had risen from just 5.05% in 1977 to 13.57%. At the same time, the volume of living trees, what scientists call live tree stock, grew from 720 million cubic meters to 3,330 million cubic meters. The journey was neither smooth nor simple. Early years were a testing ground. Which species would survive? How to plant on eroded soils? How to secure water? The answers did not come easily, but each failure, each sapling that died, informed the next wave of planning. Over time, the strategy scaled up. The program shifted from small experimental groves to massive afforestation campaigns. Engineering, ecology, and human labor were woven together in a long-term commitment. The 3 North program was not meant to be a short project. It was conceived as a multi-generational endeavor. By the early 21st century, the impact was becoming visible. Large swathes of previously degraded land began to retain vegetation. Soil erosion slowed in pilot zones. Windbreak forests formed, and new ecological patterns emerged. It became clear this was more than tree planting. It was an evolving system, a living barrier of forest, designed to hold back the forces that had plagued these regions for decades. The shifting desert. The Taklamakan required a defensive belt because it is one of the most aggressive deserts on Earth. It is the world's second largest shifting desert, covering more than 337,000 square kilometers. Almost every dune inside it is mobile. Sand waves can reach heights of more than 100 meters, and some move several meters each month. When the wind turns, entire dune fronts advance toward farmland, expressways, rail lines, and river channels. This is why local families call it the Sea of Death. It does not stay still. It pushes outward. For decades, the desert has swallowed sections of the Tarim River's tributaries, forcing repeated rerouting of canals and irrigation lines. Entire segments of the desert highways required constant clearing. Maintenance crews sometimes removed tens of thousands of cubic meters of sand in a single season, just to keep roads passable. In certain townships around the rim, buried orchards, abandoned fields, and half-covered homes show how quickly the sand can move when wind speeds exceed 40 kilometers per hour. However, the Taklamakan is not the only threat. Nearly 27% of China's land area is affected by desertification, a problem that stretches from Inner Mongolia to the Loess Plateau. More than 400 million people live in regions affected by soil degradation, wind erosion, or advancing dunes. In farming zones, topsoil loss reduces crop yields. In the pastoral areas, grasslands degrade into bare sand. In river basins, siltation clogs channels and increases flood risk. The pressure is continuous, and the affected zone spans thousands of towns and agricultural districts. The most visible symptom is the dust storm. For years, northern China experienced major spring dust events driven by wind systems that sweep across the Gobi and Taklamakan and carry fine particles deep into the country's interior. These storms once regularly reached Beijing, reducing visibility to a few hundred meters and pushing airborne particulate levels far beyond safe levels. In some events, particulate matter concentrations exceeded 1,000 micrograms per cubic meter, several times the health thresholds. The storms disrupted transport, damaged crops, and created respiratory hazards for millions of residents. Dust from these deserts has been recorded as far as the Korean Peninsula and Japan, and in rare long-range events, it has even reached North America. Each storm originates from exposed, unprotected land surfaces, areas where vegetation cover has been lost or never existed. This combination, a massive mobile desert, deteriorating land around it, and regional dust events affecting tens of millions, is why China treated the Taklamakan as a priority zone. The desert is large enough to alter weather patterns, strong enough to disrupt national transport corridors, and close enough to key population centers to pose economic and environmental risks. Stabilizing its perimeter became a strategic necessity. Confronted with this existential threat, China mobilized on a scale the world had never seen. But the initial plan was deceptively simple: draw a line on a map and plant it. The first wave of discovery. The moment the plan was approved in 1978, execution became an exercise in logistics as vast as the deserts themselves. Engineers first mapped the edges of the Taklamakan and surrounding wastelands, measuring the drift of dunes, the depth of sands, and the sparse groundwater reserves. Lines were drawn across hundreds of kilometers of unforgiving terrain. Every kilometer planted was a deliberate strike against the desert, calculated down to the angle of the rows to maximize windbreak efficiency. The first soldiers in this green army were poplars, chosen for their rapid growth. Red willows and desert poplars followed, species resilient enough to survive sudden sandstorms and extreme temperature swings. But even simple planting required ingenuity. In areas where water was scarce, teams dug deep irrigation trenches, sometimes hundreds of meters long, and lined them with clay to retain every drop. In other stretches, they built windbreaks of straw and reeds to shelter saplings from sand-laden gales until roots could take hold. By the mid-80s, millions of trees were planted annually. Villagers, soldiers, and migrant workers moved in coordinated waves, covering hundreds of kilometers in a single planting season. The work was relentless, timed to the brief windows when rain was most likely, and water trucks became lifelines, ferrying precious liters to isolated seedlings. In some areas, early mechanized planters were tested to scatter seeds across dunes too dangerous for human hands, a precursor of the high-tech methods that would emerge decades later. Within a few years, the first signs of success appeared. Lines of green, thin but visible even from satellites, began to follow the contours of the desert. Farmers reported immediate benefits. Fields that had been buried under shifting sands remained intact. Wind speeds over croplands decreased, and soil began to hold moisture for more extended periods. Where sand once swallowed roads and irrigation channels, small oases of stability emerged. By 1999, official records confirmed what the workers on the ground had already seen. More than 66 billion trees had been planted, covering an area larger than the United Kingdom. Dust storms, once a near-annual certainty in northern cities, dropped in intensity by more than 81% compared to the late 1980s. Satellite imagery documented forest coverage rising from 12% to nearly a quarter of the land, an astonishing rebound in less than 3 decades. Yet the most telling victories were local and human. In Gansu province, farmers reported that the wind had weakened. Corn and wheat grew taller. Sand that had once been relentless no longer destroyed homes and irrigation lines. The first wave of discovery proved that, at least for now, the desert could be slowed, its advance contained. The plan worked because it combined sheer scale with careful observation and adaptation. But while the early results seemed like a miracle, the seeds of a future crisis were already being sown. It appeared that the very solutions that were saving the land were beginning to poison it. The cracks appear. Right when the green wall seemed to be winning, several critical failures started to crack its foundation. The very trees meant to save the land began pulling life out of it. Fast-growing poplars, planted en masse along the desert margins, consumed groundwater at rates that local hydrology could not sustain. In regions such as Minkin, in Gansu province, rainfall averages less than 100 millimeters per year, while evaporation can exceed 20 millimeters annually. Under these conditions, any plant depends almost entirely on groundwater recharge. The large-scale planting of thirsty poplars disrupted this delicate balance. By 2010, groundwater levels had dropped by nearly 19 meters in some areas. Wells dried up, irrigation became impossible, and young saplings often failed before reaching maturity. The very species meant to hold the desert at bay was, in effect, draining the ecosystem's lifeblood. Hydrologists explain this in precise terms. Poplars have extremely high transpiration rates. A single mature populace can evaporate hundreds of liters of water per day through its leaves. When thousands of trees are planted in a belt, the cumulative water loss can exceed natural aquifer recharge by orders of magnitude. In arid regions where aquifers recharge only during occasional snowmelt or rare rain events, this imbalance is catastrophic. Ecologists had warned that, without carefully matching species to local precipitation and groundwater availability, the green wall risked undermining the very soils it was meant to protect. To quickly cover vast desert margins, planters relied heavily on poplar monocultures. Populous species are easy to propagate from cuttings, grow rapidly in arid soils, and can form continuous belts within just a few years. But uniformity is vulnerability. By 2013, reports from Jiangbei County and other sites in northern China documented massive mortality from pest outbreaks, including bark beetles and defoliating caterpillars. In Jiangbei alone, tens of millions of dollars were required to replant and reconfigure the shelter belts. Monocultures create ecological homogeneity. Every tree shares the same genetic susceptibility. Pests or pathogens that can exploit one tree can, unchecked, spread across thousands or millions of genetically identical trees. In a natural mixed forest, diversity disrupts transmission chains, allowing some species to survive even during outbreaks. In the green wall, the rapid spread of beetle infestations turned what should have been a protective barrier into a fragile, brittle line. Ecologists running long-term monitoring found that many saplings never developed deep enough root systems, lacked resilience to shifting sand, or died from drought stress. Because early successes were often reported in aggregate based on the billions of plants planted, these high mortality zones were masked in official reports. All these issues led scientists to question the very premise of the research. Was a forest wall the right ecological model for a desert? Many argued that instead of water-hungry trees, more drought-adapted shrubs and grasses would be more effective. For example, saxaul, a shrub native to arid zones, is far more efficient at anchoring sand and uses far less water. Mixed planting, shrubs, grasses, sometimes deep-rooted shrubs, can create layered ecosystems far better suited to arid soil, salt, and wind stress. Moreover, artificially dense tree belts disrupted local microhydrology. They shaded out ground vegetation, changed soil chemistry, and often required continued human intervention through irrigation and pest control just to survive. What was supposed to be a self-sustaining defensive wall looked increasingly like a fragile, maintenance-heavy experiment, one that might fail when human support wanes. Faced with these cascading failures, the scientists and engineers were forced to ask a painful question. Had they been fighting the desert the wrong way all along? The answer would require not just new technology, but a fundamental rethink of the entire battle. The second wave of discovery. When the cracks became evident, China's desert control strategy moved forward. Faced with water scarcity and ecological failures, ecologists and forestry authorities started by reevaluating species selection. The focus shifted from fast-growing poplars to native drought-resistant species. Saxaul, deeply rooted, salt-tolerant, and highly efficient at sand stabilization, rose to prominence. In some sites, Saxaul is now supported by drip irrigation systems on the margins, reducing water consumption compared to prior poplar saplings. Drip irrigation flipped the entire logic of farming. Instead of trying to saturate the soil broadly, it delivered water directly to a plant's roots, slowly, methodically, drop by drop. The system used narrow tubes, each fitted with tiny emitters, to regulate flow. These emitters released just enough moisture at just the right moment. Not a single drop was lost to evaporation or runoff. Another significant change transformed the green wall. Rather than relying on uniform belts of a single tree, the new model adopted layered vegetation designed to mimic natural ecosystems. Shrubs are planted to slow the wind at ground level, reducing the speed of blowing sand. Grasses, with dense, fibrous root networks, anchor the surface soil, preventing erosion and retaining moisture. Trees, often native, drought-tolerant species such as red willows, saxaul, and the Korshinsk pea shrub, provide vertical structure, shade, and long-term stability. Planting now follows the principles of natural succession. Pioneer species, hardy and fast-growing, are planted first to stabilize the soil. Shrubs then establish a denser layer, followed by long-lived trees, which form a canopy over the younger vegetation. This mixed approach spreads ecological risk, unlike monocultures, where a single pathogen or pest can wipe out entire stretches of forest. Layered belts are far more resilient. Research from field trials in the Taklamakan and Gobi regions shows that survival rates in these mixed systems are up to 60% higher than in early poplar-only plantations. Technology has become central to this adaptation. Drones now plant seedlings in inaccessible or hazardous terrain, along cliffs, over rapidly shifting dunes, or in areas where manual planting would risk ecological damage. Each drone can carry dozens of seedlings and deposit them with precision, placing them at optimal depth and spacing to maximize root establishment and minimize water loss. In high-risk areas, drones can plant hundreds of seedlings per hour, covering terrain that would take human teams weeks to reach. Robotic planters and mechanized systems complement this effort. These machines dig, deposit, and cover seedlings in seconds, ensuring every sapling is correctly positioned to survive arid conditions. Depth control is critical. Too shallow, and roots dry out under high evaporation. Too deep, and seedlings struggle to break through the soil. Optimal spacing ensures that each plant has access to sufficient moisture and nutrients, reducing competition and stress, a lesson learned from the first-generation belts, where dense monocultures accelerated groundwater depletion. Monitoring has been revolutionized. Remote sensors embedded in the soil continuously measure moisture, salinity, temperature, and nutrient levels, while satellite imagery tracks canopy growth, stress patterns, and emerging pest infestations across thousands of hectares. This data is fed into adaptive management systems that alert planners to potential issues in near real time. If a section shows signs of water stress or disease, irrigation can be adjusted, pests controlled, or replanting initiated before massive losses occur. Water management itself has become far more precise. Even drought-tolerant species need sufficient moisture during establishment, so irrigation is now targeted and timed based on sensor data, ensuring minimal waste and avoiding aquifer depletion. Techniques such as mulching, microcatchments, and shading reduce evaporation and conserve soil moisture. In combination with native species selection and layered planting, these practices ensure that each section of the belt has the highest possible chance of survival. But the most dangerous cracks weren't in the soil, the aquifers, or the failing poplars. They were inside the very system built to protect the wall. Because just as scientists were diagnosing ecological weaknesses, a scandal erupted, one that revealed a far more insidious threat: the temptation to sell the shield for a bottle of wine. The shield in the vineyard. In early 2021, Chinese media lit up with a story that, at first, looked too reckless to be real. At the Yangguan Forestry Farm, one of the oldest defensive shelter belts guarding the ancient oasis city of Dunhuang, hundreds of acres of protective forest had been cut down, and they had not been cleared for construction, mining, or infrastructure. They had been cleared for vineyards. For decades, Yangguan's sole mission was to hold back the Kumtag Desert, a mobile mass of sand that has threatened Dunhuang's irrigation channels and farmland for generations. The shelter belt there functioned as a windshield, a sand trap, and an ecological buffer. Its trees, especially saxaul, were chosen because they could survive with almost no water. Grapes, however, cannot. Compared to native desert species like haloxylon, vineyards can consume up to 12 times as much water. But water was only the first conflict. The farm itself, though state-owned, had been instructed to generate its own revenue. Leasing land to a booming local wine industry became the easiest path. By the early 2020s, Gansu province had transformed into a central wine-producing region, and vineyard contractors moved aggressively. Some local reports described how shelter trees were secretly girdled or burned, not for profit, but simply to remove competition for water. The scandal exploded in January 2021, when investigative reporters revealed large-scale, head-shaving clear-cutting. Within days, the Gansu provincial government issued a swift denial. Their report, released on January 26, insisted there had been no significant deforestation. Only the the replacement of dying trees and a few isolated violations. But the public didn't buy it, and Beijing didn't either. After the investigation, authorities acted quickly to impose consequences. Several local officials were formally disciplined for their involvement, though exact numbers and identities weren't publicly disclosed. More importantly, the scandal pushed the government to lock in a major structural reform. Yangguan Forest Farm was officially redesignated as a fully state-funded public welfare institution. This shift removed the financial pressure that had previously pushed the farm toward profit-driven choices, such as tearing down protective forests and planting water-hungry vineyards. Making a green livelihood. Recognizing that planting trees alone would fail without local communities on board, the government has leaned hard into the grain for green model. Rather than simply paying people to stop farming, this program weaves together restoration and livelihood. Farmers in marginal, erosion-prone lands are paid to retire their fields, but they don't just walk away. Under Grain for Green, they become active participants in the regreening. They plant seedlings, maintain shrubs, prune trees, and monitor the growth of the forest belt. By working on the very land that was once degraded, they gain employment, income, and a long-term stake in the outcome. In Inner Mongolia, for example, local forestry authorities say that cooperatives recruit pastoralists and farmers into work-for-aid sand control projects, paying them wages to plant and tend vegetation. The impact is significant. According to national data, the 3 North Shelter Belt program has helped around 15 million people achieve stable income gains through its economic ecological construction. Tens of thousands of local workers are involved in these programs. In 2023 alone, more than 87,000 farmers and herders in sandy regions participated in work-for-aid labor, collectively receiving over 1.06 billion yuan in compensation. But the program's ambition goes beyond labor payments. The Shelter Belt is also being turned into a green economy. In many parts of the region, economic forests are planted, not just trees for windbreaks, but species that generate real harvestable value. According to government sources, the program has built 4.63 million hectares of economic forest, producing fruits, herbs, and other products. These eco-crops contribute to an industry with an annual output value of around 120 billion yuan, supporting households directly. Among the species cultivated are desert-adapted plants with real market demand, medicinal herbs that tolerate saline soil, shrubs with harvestable leaves, and fruit-bearing trees like jujube. For many farming families, these plants are both a source of income and a way to anchor themselves to a fragile landscape. As one villager put it, working on the restoration belt is not just putting down roots in the soil, it's putting down roots in the community's long-term future. This integration of work, restoration, and economics helps secure the belt. When locals depend on the forest for income, they become its guardians. They regulate grazing, protect young plants, avoid overuse of water, and replant where saplings fail. Their livelihoods are woven directly into the ecological mission. There are real examples of success. In cooperation with local governments, work-for-aid mechanisms in Inner Mongolia have brought more than 1,000 rural residents into sand control jobs in recent project cycles. Some of them report monthly incomes of nearly 10,000 yuan, working close to home in the sand control zones, planting and caring for wind-resistant shrubs. By aligning environmental restoration with local economic benefit, China's Grain for Green program transforms the Green Wall from a top-down ecological project into a living, working landscape. For many people in the 3 North regions, the Green Barrier isn't just protection, it's a pathway to income, community, and a more resilient future. As China refined its model, a powerful new question emerged. Could the hard-won lessons from the Taklamakan be exported? The answer lay thousands of miles away, in the sands of another continent, where a parallel struggle was unfolding, with dramatically different results. The global echo, when the belt becomes a blueprint. Right as China completes its monumental green belt around the Taklamakan, its desert control strategies are already traveling beyond its borders, not as vanity, but as a tested model. This is not just a national success. It is becoming a global prototype, as China's hard-earned lessons in desert stabilization are being exported to other deserts, particularly in Africa, where the need is both ecological and existential. One of the most consequential projects is unfolding in Mauritania, where Chinese scientists and local partners have established the China-Africa Green Technology Park. Built by the Xinjiang Institute of Ecology and Geography, ICSIG, of the Chinese Academy of Sciences, the park officially opened in early 2024. Located in the Trarza region, on the edge of the Saharan sands, this 4-hectare demonstration site integrates several zones: a sand-blocking buffer, orchards, vegetable plots, forage plants, and even a poultry area. Solar panels line the field, powering groundwater pumps that feed a drip-irrigated grid of crops, a desert oasis built on technology scaled from northern China. The results, though early, are striking. Chinese and Mauritanian teams have stabilized 100 hectares of sandy land using sand fixation techniques adapted from Xinjiang. Of that, 4 hectares have already been converted into viable oases. Seedling survival rates in the tech park exceed 90% thanks to smart irrigation and solar-powered pumps. Local capacity is growing. The partnership has trained 45 local technicians in greening technologies, and the project has created about 120 jobs for nearby communities. China has also installed 5 smart weather stations to monitor microclimate, soil moisture, and sand movement. This cooperation did not emerge overnight. The first formal agreement went back to 2017, when CAS began sharing its desert engineering research with Mauritanian counterparts. In December 2024, the two sides signed a memorandum to expand the effort. 10,000 hectares of carbon sink forest are planned, using the technology park as a blueprint for a scalable, locally adapted model. Some of the strategies used mirror the ones in China, but they are being adapted to radically different environmental conditions. In Mauritania, dunes are broader and less cohesive than those in China's deserts, so researchers redesigned the traditional straw checkerboard system, using smaller, multi-layered grids to stabilize the shifting sands more effectively. Combined with solar-powered drip irrigation, this creates a hybrid system that uses both engineering and biological methods, rooted in Chinese desert control, but tailored to Africa. There are direct parallels in the ecological livelihood logic. The China-Africa Park doesn't just aim to fix the sand. Part of it is economic. Vegetables, forage plants, and trees are grown in concert, providing food, job opportunities, and sustainable income for local people. Former herders are now working as irrigation technicians, pump operators, and nursery managers. Some of the first eco-craftsmen emerging from the desert are local youth trained by Chinese experts. Chinese researchers are not limiting their work to Mauritania. According to Lei Jiaqiang, a desert restoration expert, China is also collaborating with Nigeria and Ethiopia. Their approaches vary. In Nigeria, the focus is on soil erosion control, while in Ethiopia, they are testing combinations of artificial grasses and local species to restore degraded grasslands. That variation shows that China's model is not one size fits all. The green wall concept is being adapted to local ecology and social context, including species, grid design, and irrigation. That adaptability increases the project's legitimacy and its potential for success. But replication doesn't erase risk. The soils, hydrology, and social systems of African deserts differ from those in Western China. Success in Mauritania doesn't guarantee success in all Sahelian countries. Water access, community buy-in, long-term maintenance, and costs remain big questions. In Mauritania, for example, the demonstration park is small. Expanding to 10,000 hectares will test whether the model can scale without sacrificing performance. There is also the risk of over-reliance on irrigation. While solar pumps reduce fossil fuel dependency, they still draw from underground water.